Okay, Year 10, so we are moving on to a brand new topic, and this topic is called the living world. Now, the living world is part of Paper 1, so this falls in with the same topics such as rivers and coasts, and also natural hazards, which you do at the end of Year 11. So on the screen at the minute, we have a learning journey. So the first lessons that we're going to be looking at this week are ecosystems and what they are, and then changes and impacts to ecosystems. We're going to be able to define an ecosystem by the end of this lesson and describe relationships between living and non-living things within an ecosystem, and then look at small-scale ecosystems such as a hedgerow and a freshwater pond. So please make sure you have your notes, the PDF document or the Word document open, and you might have to choose to have them side by side, and you're completing the tasks as we go through them in the video. So you might want to frequently pause this video after each task and then complete the activities. Then remember, once you have completed all of the tasks, you need to assign them into the assignment folder that I've created. And if you're struggling to do that, then just send them to me on the Messenger service. Okay then, so task 1, what is an ecosystem? Well, we can see here on the screen that there are a variety of things mentioned. So we've got plants such as the tree, we've got the rabbit, which is a herbivore, so they're eating the plants. Then we've got carnivores, so they eat herbivores or animals. And then we have decomposers, so they're things like worms and mushrooms that break down and decompose and add nutrients back to the cycle. And you can see that they're all joined by these lines. So what is an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is an environment containing a community of interdependent plants and animals. So interdependent means they rely on each other. So they're made up of living organisms such as plants and animals, and they also interact with non-living organisms such as the water, the soil, and also the sun. Now, ecosystems are really important because they are a community, and that's a really important word. They make up a community, which means that they coexist. So, if the sun stopped shining, or we had a period of no sunshine, then the plants wouldn't be able to photosynthesize, and then as a result we would have a lack of plants. If the plants then died, then the herbivores and the carnivores would also lose out. So that's what we mean by they all rely on each other, and they're linked in a chain, which you can see from these arrows. So make sure you've written down your definition for task 1 before you move on to the next slide, which is talking about task 2. Okay then, now before we move on to task 2, I want to show us these different ecosystems. So these are just some more information that you might want to add to your definition of an ecosystem. So they're home to many of the world's most recognised yet endangered species. So we've got here the orangutan in the bottom right hand corner, obviously the polar bear on the left, the panda. They're also home to the world's fruits, plants, flowers and trees. So we can see here we've got a mixture of cacti, we've got luscious green forests in the tropical rainforests. We've then got more sparsely distributed plants and trees, which is in the savanna in the top right-hand corner. And then we've got a tundra, which is obviously very snowy, similar to the weather we actually have today whilst I'm recording this video. And they provide us with food, resources and the air that we breathe. They're also home to the world's species of marine life, so they provide us with our main sources of drinking water. So we've got such as the Great Barrier Reef that we find in Australia, and then we've also got examples of the River Nile and the Amazon River. And they're also home to different people around the world. So within different ecosystems, we have different tribes and different cultures who bring a different way of life. And the Penan tribes that we learn about later in this topic are susceptible to threat, and their everyday existence is being threatened as we cut down the trees. So let's move on to task 2 then. An ecosystem, as I've already mentioned, is a community of living and non-living things, and they work together to survive. Now, when we use the terms living and non-living, it's important that we use the words biotic and abiotic instead. Now, biotic is the fancy definition for living organisms or living material. Whereas abiotic is examples of non-living material. So let's use this next image that you have on your tasks to look at examples of both. So I'm going to shade in my biotic as orange and my abiotic as blue. So abiotic examples are non-living. So things such as sunlight and heat would be examples of non-living. The water in itself is non-living. So you might just want to write water or fresh water. Other things such as the soil. So you can't see the soil like written on here, but soil is also an example of non-living material. And the rest that we can see, such as the algae, the bacteria, we've got fungi, termite mounds, insects, plants. These are all examples of biotic materials. Task 3 then, we have got a keyword matchup. So on your PDFs or Word documents, you will see that you have got the definitions for lots of keywords, and the keywords are on the board now. So use the images to try and help you match the correct word to the correct definition. Now, I'm going to give you some helpful hints. So when we think about eutrophication is when we have an excessive richness of nutrients in a lake. So we have a richness of nutrients in a lake. So that can help things grow faster. Okay, so it's going to lead to an excessive growth of plant life. So that's why I'm just drawing lots of little shrubs and plants on here. When we think about a food web, we're looking at this very complex chain here. So it's how we're all interconnected, and it's not more of a simple line, whereas a food chain kind of looks more like this. And we look at food webs and food chains in more depth in the next lesson. A consumer is someone that's consuming and eating things. So think about eating when you're looking at the definition for that. Whereas a producer is producing food. So they rely on sunlight to make food, such as plants. Okay, a decomposer is when it dies, it breaks down nutrients and adds it back to the cycle. So you'll use all of this helpful hints on the board to help you answer task 3. And then here are the answers. So please make sure before you move on to task 4 that all of your answers are correct and they are next to the correct definition. Okay, task 4 then, we're going to look at specific examples of local ecosystems. So the reason that I have just kind of reiterated local is because ecosystems exist at a range of different scales. So we can have local ecosystems, and then we can also have small global ecosystems. So local ecosystems are talking about a pond or a hedgerow. So you can see this image here is an example of a pond. Whereas global ecosystems are much larger in scale. They're known as tropical rainforests, deciduous woodlands, or tundras, or sometimes also known as deserts. So what I would like you to do for task 4 is to use the diagram which you have on your sheet and we also have on the board and highlight it. So using the key, producer, consumer, decomposer, and the definitions from task 3, I would like you to go through and highlight and identify the following from the food web. So I've done a worm for you. So a worm is an example of a decomposer. So let's have a look at some more examples. A heron then, so a heron would be at the very, very top of the food chain, so they're consuming things. Okay, so is a diving beetle, so would be things like the dragonfly, okay? And it doesn't say whether they are like herbivores or carnivores, it just says that they are consuming food, whereas things such as the, let me have a change my colour. The algae would be an example of a producer. So things like algae, microphytes, these are all examples of producers. So please make sure you do that for the rest of the ecosystem. And I've also written down the keywords for things like detritus, in case you don't know what they are. And then there's a little challenge that you can do. So explain how these work together and they are connected to each other. So if we were thinking about how they were connected, well, all of the plants use sunlight. So they rely on sunlight to grow. Okay? And that allows things like algae, macrophytes to be produced. So these are then produced, and then because these are produced, things like the shrimp, the snail, etc., they can all consume them. However, if the algae stopped being produced, then the shrimp would not have enough food. So animals would start to die, and then they would leave behind waste material, so they would die and decompose. So that is when we're thinking about how they are connected. It takes us back to task 1 when we're looking at our definition about what actually an ecosystem was and how they are interconnected. Task 5 then is looking at another local ecosystem known as a hedgerow. So what I would like you to do for this is match the correct word to the correct definition and then decide which example would go with which keyword. So I've given you pictures of what they look like. So the blackberry bush is obviously a plant. A greenfly is an example of a primary consumer, so more of a herbivore. And then the thrush and the sparrowhawk are birds. So what then is a producer? Well, a producer uses photosynthesis and sunlight and water to take in nutrients from the soil. So these are just coming back to the examples that we did in the last part of the lesson. And what would be an example of a producer? Well, it would be the blackberry bush. Okay then, so what is a primary consumer? So a primary consumer is an organism that feeds on a producer. So it's feeding on plants. So our example of that would be the greenfly. What's a secondary consumer then? What's the difference? So a secondary consumer feeds on herbivores, so they're still quite low down the food chain. They're not eating animals. They're just eating. They are eating animals, but they're only eating animals that eat producers. So this is our example, and our example of what a secondary consumer is would be the thrush. And then the tertiary consumer is at the very top of the food chain. So they are the largest and fastest hunters, and they eat herbivores, carnivores, and sometimes they can also eat producers. So our example of this would be a sparrowhawk. So you can see they kind of fall into a pattern. So the blackberry bush is the producer, the greenfly is the primary consumer, the thrush is the secondary consumer, and the sparrowhawk would be the tertiary consumer.